Myra is my name. Lizzie, my older sister, is 3 years my senior. In addition, my biological father, stepfather, and mother all reside outside of our home. I could explain things thus simply in a typical household, but I can't do that with me. My family's tale is far more tragic and nuanced. Looking back, it's possible that Lizzie's success on the admission exam for a prominent private primary school marked the beginning of the fissures in my family. Although I was too little to recall, my father subsequently told me that my mother was ecstatic about this at the time. Lizzie's future is guaranteed. There could have been partiality for my sister underlying such remarks. Lizzie was referred to by my mother as a super child. In addition to passing the admission test for a tough private school, she began playing the piano at the age of 3 and began taking French conversation lessons at the age of 4. Lizzie's accomplishments were shown with pride by my mother, who treated them as her personal awards. In contrast, I was a typical youngster who was also ill. My asthma was persistent. My academic performance was mediocre. I didn't do any physical activity, and I lacked any really noteworthy abilities. I didn't, however, like sketching. When I drew a picture of my family in kindergarten, my teacher applauded it and put it up in the classroom. But my mother didn't care about my artwork. Drawing is fine, as long as it's just a hobby. I'm curious whether my mother ever understood how much such remarks hurt my impressionable heart. There were occasions when I frantically sought to win my mother's love. My dream of finding a unique skill like Lizzie's was never fulfilled. The only thing my mother ever paid attention to was Lizzie. My real father was the one who rescued me from that loneliness. He always made time for Lizzie and me on his days off. He began spending those days painting with me once he discovered how much I enjoyed it. My dad used to say, "Myra, your drawings are wonderful," in reference to my awkward drawings. He informed me one day that he had one of my drawings on display on his desk at work. I can still clearly recall how delighted I was to hear that. Lizzie and I were never treated differently by my father. He would push the swing for each of us the same amount of times when we went to the park. He always took care to select ice creams that were equally valuable for us both when he went shopping. My heart was touched by such modest gestures of concern. He used to touch our heads and say, "Myra, I want both you and Lizzie to dream big." He would listen to our stories, laugh with us, and give our problems careful thought, even when he was exhausted when he got home. The loneliness I experienced from my mother's lack of interest was progressively alleviated by his presence. My 6th birthday is still fresh in my mind. My mother wasn't there that day since Lizzie had extracurricular activities. In the evening, I was by myself at home. My mother didn't mind leaving young me at home because it was common to be left alone like that. I usually merely drew and waited, but it was my birthday that day. I couldn't celebrate or eat cake with anyone, so I felt alone. My busy father, however, changed his plans and arrived home early. Even though he was unable to prepare a cake from scratch, I can still picture him painstakingly arranging candles on the cake he purchased from the grocery store. His advice, "Myra, just be yourself and find what you love," was the exact antithesis of my mother's view that I needed to be unique. I learned the value of being normal from my father. But things drastically altered in my day-to-day existence when I was 7 years old. The divorce of my parents was the reason. The picture of my father's back as he left the home and the muffled sound of my mother's wailing are forever etched in my heart, even though I don't have many recollections from that period. The warmth of my father's big palm seemed to linger forever as he gave me my final head pat, but it quickly faded into memory. My mother believed that my father's pay was insufficient, particularly once my sister Lizzie began attending a private primary school. My father was a sales representative for a reputable firm. Our family's finances were strained by my mother's social activities and the cost of college. Outings with other mothers from Lizzie's private school, referred to as mom friends, accounted for the majority of my mother's social spending. Every week, they gathered for lunch at fancy places, and my mother always purchased brand new clothing and bags. My mother would tell me, "This is a necessary expense for social networking," ignoring my father's protests. In fact, among Lizzie's classmates, my mother belonged to a group of moms from especially affluent households. She maintained that it was there that she learned vital information about the top cram schools and worthwhile extracurricular activities. However, it appeared to me that her primary objective was to indulge in upscale boutique shopping or receive beauty services in salons reserved for members. Arguments over credit card bills were inevitable when my father was paid. Why is a Hermes scarf necessary? You wouldn't comprehend. I don't want to be seen as the odd one out among the moms at that school. One day, I vividly recall the pile of receipts my father spread out on the desk. Afternoon tea on Fifth Avenue, a French restaurant in the Upper East Side, and a nail salon in Soho. Occasionally, the expense of a single luncheon exceeded my father's daily income. Using the justification of sharing information with the other moms about other extracurricular activities, such as piano, ballet, and French courses, my mother persisted in her extravagant spending. She said it was all for Lizzie, but I frequently questioned whether it was actually for her own ego. The child who lives next door is attending a summer camp abroad. We must also send Lizzie. Despite his best efforts, my father was never able to satisfy her demands. My mother's demands continued to grow indefinitely. On occasion, I glanced at my father's desk to see the household ledger. I witnessed him frantically attempting to balance the household budget amid rows of red figures. I can still hear the sound of him tapping the calculator late at night. My father put in a lot of labor for the family in spite of everything. He began working on the weekends and was obviously worn out when he returned home. But Dad still showed me the same love and respect as Lizzie. He caressed our heads and whispered, "You're my precious treasures," and I can still feel the warmth. He would take us to the park on his days off. We would spread out a picnic sheet, bring our own handmade meals, and spend time as a family. In hindsight, that could have been our final genuinely joyful experience. However, my mother was never able to comprehend my father's endeavors. She would add, "Your income isn't enough to secure Lizzie's future," and their disputes appeared to go on forever. My mother's irate voice would frequently reverberate throughout the home when I woke up in the middle of the night. To block out the sounds, Lizzie would turn up the music in her room. All I could do was lie in bed with my face buried in my pillow, shaking. My father's overwork eventually caused him to collapse, which resulted in the divorce. But to everyone around us, my mother told a different tale. When my mother told neighbors and school authorities that my father had died, she was lying. "My husband had an accident at work," she said. She replied, "Widowhood looks better than divorce," and Lizzie and I were both silenced. The teachers and parents at Lizzie's exclusive school were absolutely prohibited from discussing my father, and all of his pictures were stored away. My mom gave a perfect performance. With the life insurance my husband left behind, I'm doing my best to provide for my children's education, she'd add. She would occasionally even cry while telling a narrative that made others feel sorry for her. That deception caused me to suffer. My father was alive and still thinking about us, but I had to conceal his presence. That was an intolerable burden for a youngster. Although I was unaware of it at the time, I later found out that my father had been paying child support on a regular basis following the divorce. My mother met Davis a year after the divorce. He had a corporation that dealt in real estate. My mother was parenting us by herself at the time due to financial difficulties, and Davis appeared to provide her with solace. "For the sake of the children, let's build a new family together," he said to her. My mother's deception conveniently persisted through the remarriage, and I believe those words preserved her. My mom would add, "Davis saved me after I lost my husband," making the narrative seem like something from a fairy tale. My mother presented Davis to us as our new father when he initially arrived at our house. I was frightened, but Lizzie smiled at him. I gazed at my father's memory's shadow, as though it were concealed behind Davis. When I was 8 years old, my mother remarried Davis after just 6 months of dating. Despite the lavish wedding and my mother's joyful appearance, I couldn't get rid of my intense uneasiness. There was an uneasy sensation that finally turned into reality. My mother exclaimed with pleasure, We can finally be a normal family now. But she was entirely mistaken. I couldn't get Lizzie to warm up to her stepfather, but she did. On the surface, Davis seemed nice, but I knew otherwise. He only showed Lizzie compassion, and his behavior toward me was radically different. Lizzie's favorite foods were always on the table during meals, and my tastes were totally disregarded. I think he resented me for not accepting him. He soon became completely obedient to my mother. My asthma got worse at that time. I had the feeling that I was drowning beneath water during an assault. I couldn't get the air into my lungs. I was having trouble breathing. The terror and the suffering were indescribable. I had to bear the attacks by myself when they occurred at night. I could hear my mother and Davis talking about Lizzie's academic prospects from the adjacent room. My loneliness was more painful than my asthma. Yet no one listened to me, despite the local doctor's repeated warnings that I should get a thorough evaluation at a larger hospital. My mother and Davis consistently sidestepped the issue and put it off. I kept hearing the same thing. Investing in Lizzie's future comes first. Her extracurricular activities are costly. I passed out at the school nurse's office one day. During class, I suddenly had an asthma attack. My mother resisted the school nurse's attempt to call an ambulance, saying, "I'll come pick her up myself." Consequently, I had to wait for my mother for an hour while resting in the nurse's office. The nurse repeatedly pleaded with my mother to allow them to call an ambulance, but she obstinately refused. My sister Lizzie, meantime, had begun modeling at her esteemed private school. She was always one of the best pupils. Lizzie believed that no cost was too high. My mother and stepfather were the same way. My mother was hesitant to send me to a big hospital for a professional assessment, even when my asthma episodes got worse. She justified it by saying, going to the hospital takes time and money. As a result, I suffered many assaults without receiving the necessary attention. A brand new computer and shelves brimming with pricey educational resources for Lizzie's extracurricular activities were found in her room. On the other hand, my room was filled with faded and tattered hand-me-down clothing and outdated textbooks. With every year that went by, the distance between us widened. The burden of my family's disregard was worse than the oppressive ache of my asthma. Everything changed drastically when I was in 9th grade. I was feeling under the weather that morning. I thought I would have an asthma attack, but my stepfather went to work and my mother went to go with Lizzie to her practice examinations. I was left alone at home. I had informed my mother the previous evening, "I don't feel good," but she dismissed it. "It's probably just in your head and you'll be fine. Exams for Lizzie are more crucial." Early in the afternoon, my suspicions were validated. I suddenly had an asthma attack. My breathing quickly deteriorated, and I attempted to take my regular prescription, but it had no impact. My mother's phone was off when I phoned her. I could die if this continues. Terror took control. I called my biological father's phone out of desperation, even though I wasn't permitted to. I had seen it on my mother's call history and had quietly scribbled it down. I would frequently glance at the number and consider calling him, but I was always too terrified of my mother's wrath. But this time was different. I pressed the number with shaking fingers, feeling as though my life depended on it. "Hey, Dad," assist me. "Is that you, Myra? What's the matter?" I stated the problem, breathing heavily. As soon as I heard my father's voice, a flood of fond memories returned to me, including the touch of his hand on the day we said goodbye, the breeze on the swings when he pushed me at the park, and the view from his shoulders when he gave me piggyback rides. My dad did something right away. "I'm now phoning an ambulance. I'll see you in the medical facility." I started crying as soon as I heard his guarantee. Suddenly, everything I had been suppressing fell apart. In less than 10 minutes, the ambulance came. My awareness started to wane as I heard the paramedics racing in. I was already resting in a hospital bed when I awoke. My dad was waiting for me there. "Myra, I'm so grateful. Had we arrived any later?" With tears running down his cheeks, he firmly grasped my hand. Compared to what I recalled, my father appeared slimmer. There were more gray strands in his hair, but his kind eyes remained the same. Everything started to become clear when he remained by my side in the hospital until my health stabilized. My father had been making monthly child support payments after the divorce, which included a sizable sum intended for Lizzie and me. But none of the money went into my medical care. Lizzie had taken up all of it. Using the child support money, my mother and stepfather had even bought a vacation house that was supposed to be a part of Lizzie's future. They would take Lizzie there and have extravagant parties on the weekends. They never once mentioned the existence of the vacation house when they informed me they were heading out for Lizzie's modeling job. In the meantime, my essential hospital visits were limited, and the funds required for my life-saving therapies were denied. My dad was enraged. This is blatant fraud and, more importantly, it is abuse and endangerment of children. He informed the police about the situation. My mother and stepfather were suspected of medical negligence and fraud, so they were called in for interrogation. My mother admitted to everything during the inquiry. However, her attitude was belligerent rather than repentant. Lizzie has talent, and it takes money to develop that talent. Myra is only a typical youngster. The inquiry moved swiftly forward. The cops found thorough records of the expenditures made with the child support funds. The $2,000 my father had been providing each month was mostly utilized for Lizzie, including costly private tutoring, training programs abroad, a California vacation house, and even cosmetic surgery for Lizzie's modeling career. In the meantime, my basic insurance had barely reimbursed the bare minimum of my medical bills. The hospital's doctors told us that my illness wouldn't have gotten so bad if I had gotten the right care sooner. My health had already deteriorated irreparably by that point. I spent a long time in the hospital. With his rage mounting daily, my father declared, "This cannot be allowed to go unpunished." After speaking with an attorney, he started getting ready to prosecute my mother and stepfather. They were eventually taken into custody on suspicion of child abuse and fraud. During her arrest, my mother yelled, "I did nothing wrong." Lizzie's ability needed to be nurtured. I was overcome with mixed feelings when I heard her sobs. My mother was still my mother even if she had mistreated me and embezzled funds intended for my welfare. I looked aside because I couldn't stand to see her being driven away in the police car. I went into her room after she left. I discovered a lone picture of myself as a kid in a drawer tucked away in the back. My mother was holding me and grinning broadly in the photo. When did she start concentrating only on Lizzie and cease noticing me? The case immediately caught the media's attention since it involved unequal treatment between sisters, medical negligence, and child support fraud. 8 years of faking a father's death was the shocking headline. My mother's social circle was greatly impacted when it was discovered that my father was still alive. Lizzie's deception infuriated the PTO members at her school. Most of the parents had known one other for years because Lizzie had gone to the same exclusive private school from elementary school through high school. My mother had acted as though she was mourning the death of her husband for years, but it was all a lie. When they learned the reality, many felt deceived. So those were also artificial tears. We even invited her out to dinner since we were so SAD for her. She disregarded our generosity. My mother's fabrications grew into something enormous. The neighbors' responses differed. She always carried herself as though she were superior to everyone else, in my opinion. However, the kids, how unfortunate for them. Isn't it amazing that her spouse was still alive? Rapid rumors began to circulate, and an increasing number of interested bystanders gathered in front of our home. My mother's web of lies came apart one by one as the trial went on. My father was thought to be dead, even by my stepfather. Layer by layer, the ornate facade my mother had built was gradually taken away. The trial, however, exposed something more sinister behind it all: my mother's own inner problems. During the trial, a mental health assessment found that she had a severe case of approval-seeking illness. She obsessively lied to keep up an ideal image since she was so afraid of what other people thought of her. All of the aberrations in our family were probably caused by this unhealthy inclination. But occasionally, I can't help but wonder, What if my mother had acknowledged the divorce right away? What if she had been able to live a life free from looks and other people's opinions? Would the course of our family's history have been different? Lizzie paid me a visit in the hospital throughout all of this. With tears running down her cheeks, Lizzie murmured, "Myra, I'm so sorry." She was also a victim. She hadn't been able to exercise her own free will because of the weight of my mother's and stepfather's expectations. They had had complete control over her life. I realized her pain for the first time. Lizzie confided in me. She informed me that she had no say in the cosmetic surgery or modeling. She remarked in a shaky voice, "The truth is, I never wanted to be a model." "You're special," my mother would often remind me, but being special just made me feel burdened. I couldn't have regular pals since I was unique. I was unable to wear the things I liked because I was unique. Her standards determined everything. Lizzie has been battling anorexia since middle school. For magazine photos, she had been made to follow strict diets. It's possible that my mother had chosen not to recognize Lizzie's pain. Lizzie smiled shyly and admitted, "The truth is, I wanted to be a chef." However, Mom would often ask, "A model?" Being a chef is absurd. Thus, the only times I truly enjoyed myself were in my school's cookery classes. Lizzie showed me the screen of her phone after pulling it out. It was crammed with pictures of food she had prepared, secretly taken images, like personal jewels she had kept concealed. She questioned, "Myra, we didn't know anything about one another, did we? Our mother disregarded you, and I had to bear the weight of being unique. But things will be different from now on, won't it?" I gave a strong nod. Before, we hadn't developed a true sisterly bond, but now things would be different. All Lizzie had wanted was to be a typical high school girl and lead a normal life. "I'm sorry too, Lizzie. What you were going through escaped my notice." We sobbed and held each other. It would take time to mend the years we spent misinterpreting one another and the times we continued to miss one another emotionally. However, there was no doubt that this marked the start of something new for us. My father was granted custody of Lizzie and me. He prepared a new house for us and changed his work schedule. Despite being modest, the home exuded warmth. Lizzie gave up her profession in entertainment to concentrate on her education as a typical high school student. My asthma gradually started to get better with the right medical attention. After the trial, my mother and stepfather were sentenced to jail. My mother persisted in defending her behavior right up until the very end of the sentencing day. I was so depressed as I watched her. She had forgotten what it was to be truly happy. Our family has now started a new phase. With the same tenderness he always had, my father surrounds us. The three of us have a custom of cooking together on the weekends. Lizzie is in charge of organizing the meal, and my father and I assist her. Even if things don't always go as planned, such instances are still cherished recollections. My father has a picture of Lizzie and me on his desk at work. It's a straightforward photograph of us rather than one of her glitzy modeling shots. Despite our differences, my father loves us for who we are. Lizzie has begun her studies in preparation for attending a culinary school. "I want to open my own cafe when I grow up," she said, her eyes glimmering with anticipation. I never noticed that she had a natural radiance when she was modeling. My asthma has considerably improved with consistent hospital stays and appropriate care. Now that I'm not always afraid of assaults, I've started to consider my dreams. I want to use my passion for art, which I have had since I was a young child, to make people feel better. Slowly, that dream is starting to take shape. My name is Catherine Thompson, and I was born 3 minutes after Jennifer, my twin sister. Our lives were significantly impacted by those brief moments. Even though we were just 3 minutes apart, it had a significant impact on how our paths diverged. In a peaceful suburban area, our parents, Richard and Dorothy, operated a real estate company. My mother often wore high-end clothing and applied makeup to her face before going out to show off her opulent properties. My father was absorbed in the realm of numbers and devoted to running the business. Our family put on a show of unity on the outside. However, Underlying this facade was a subtle yet widespread distortion that, by the time I was 5 years old, I was vividly aware of. We were fraternal twins at birth. As a result, we had different face traits and appearances, exactly as siblings in other families with a difference in age. Jennifer looked nearly angelic with her gorgeous, glowing face and slightly curled hair. I, on the other hand, was very ordinary, unassuming, and easily missed, definitely not the angelic type. Our parents made very different choices for us, in contrast to other parents who might dress their twins same. I was given hand-me-downs or discount stuff, while Jennifer was decked out in the newest designer fashion. She used real Barbie dolls to play with, while I used dollar shop imitations. Jennifer consistently received more gifts and a larger portion of everything, including our birthday cakes. Jennifer began taking ballet lessons when she was 6 years old. I was informed that it was not possible to enroll both of us when I asked if I could take them as well. Ironically, Jennifer's extracurricular activities, painting courses, piano lessons, and gymnastics kept growing. The pictures of our family showed it. Jennifer was always the focus of attention, wearing expensive clothing from high-end children's stores, while I went unnoticed in mass-produced, generic clothing. I felt like an outsider in my own family's pictures. Every night when I laid in bed and stared up at the ceiling, I would think, maybe my parents don't see me. As a child, I was able to tolerate the differences in material belongings since I realized that one does not need expensive toys or clothes to survive. But the true hurt came from the obvious gap in our parents' love. Our parents would lean in and listen intently to everything Jennifer said. On the other hand, they would never look at me while I spoke. They would immediately return the topic to Jennifer after responding in a way that left it questionable if they were even paying attention. There was a sliver of hope when they started primary school. Wearing matching school uniforms, complete with clean white blouses, checkered skirts, and navy blazers, I secretly hoped that I would be treated as an equal. Smile, our mother would tell us when we were taking pictures. Jennifer was always in the center of her camera lens. Jennifer, look slightly to the right. Absolutely flawless. My old Hardy came back. It was obvious who my mother was determined to highlight, even in the same uniform. With alphabet charts on the walls and tables organized properly, our classroom was a tidy, orderly place. We were placed alphabetically by our instructor, Ms. Johnson, even though we were twins in the same class. We were seated next to each other in the configuration Thompson-Thompson. For once, someone from outside our home seemed to treat us equally. This appearance of equality, though, was fleeting and vanished as soon as we left the classroom. Every day, the same scene was performed. When my mother's black SUV arrived, she would tell me without looking at me, "Catherine, go straight home and do your homework." Then, smiling broadly, turning to face Jennifer, "Let's go to your ballet lesson, Jennifer." Jennifer's lessons took up the entire week. Monday was ballet, Tuesday was piano, Wednesday was art, Thursday was gymnastics, and Friday was drama. After I watched them go, I would go into the quiet house by myself. I pushed myself into my studies in the hopes that my parents would notice me if I got great scores. I spent hours at the kitchen table reading ahead in textbooks, practicing the alphabet, and working on math problems. There would be a long pause before I heard their happy voices resonating in the corridor and the garage door opening. Every day, I studied by myself in the empty house, clinging to the slim hope that my mother might notice me. "Mom, I got a perfect score on my test." One day, I held up my answer sheet and made an announcement. She said apathetically, "That's nice, Catherine," as she arranged Jennifer's ballet bag. "Jennifer, show your father your new dance." But I didn't give up. I collected my perfect scores, accolades from teachers, and numerous gold star stickers like precious treasures, each harboring a silent prayer that they might one day be enough to draw my parents' gaze. Then, one pivotal night, everything was irrevocably altered. It was just after I turned 12. Having finished my homework, I was on my way to get some water when I overheard my parents' voices coming from the study. Normally, I would ignore their conversations, but this time, I found myself stopping in my tracks. Sometimes I wonder. My father's voice carried an unusual weight. Maybe it was too much for us, he said. What? What do you mean? My mother asked. Having twins. Jennifer alone would have been enough. She's the perfect daughter we always wanted. But two? I understand, my mother sighed. Jennifer is special. She has a wonderful future ahead of her. But Catherine, she's just there. It would have been better if it had just been Jennifer. I almost dropped the glass I was holding. I hastily grabbed it again, but in its place, it felt as though my heart shattered like an illusionary echo. At that moment, everything became clear. All the years I spent trying to earn my parents' love, holding on to the hope that maybe things would change, all of it seemed foolish. They never wanted me from the beginning. I was the unnecessary twin, the daughter who should not have been born. That night marked a change within me. I stopped seeking my parents' approval and instead focused on my academics, setting my sights on independence from my family. Freed from the burden of trying to please them, my mind opened up in unexpected ways. My already good grades improved significantly as I moved on to middle school. Excellent analysis, Catherine, MS. Anderson praised me during English class, holding up my essay. This is the depth of thought I am looking for, everyone. I could feel Jennifer's pencil hitting the desk harder as she sat next to me, her face turning red with frustration. This scenario was repeated in other subjects: math, science, social studies. The more the teachers praised my work, the more intense Jennifer's reactions became. One evening, I inadvertently overheard Jennifer's grievances echoing from the living room below. Mom, the teachers are being mean. They always praise Catherine and make me look bad. They're doing it on purpose. The next day, my mother, her designer brand handbag swinging, stormed into the school with the click of her heels echoing down the hallway. Why are the teachers discriminating against Jennifer? She demanded in the principal's office. Mr. Harrison, our homeroom teacher, maintained a calm and professional demeanor. MRS. Thompson, this isn't a case of discrimination. Please take a look at their academic records. He carefully displayed our grades for her inspection. Catherine consistently achieves top marks across all her subjects. As for Jennifer, are you saying my Jennifer is stupid? My mother interrupted. Not at all, but Catherine's academic performance is. This is exactly the discrimination I'm talking about. You clearly have a bias against Jennifer. No amount of evidence could convince her otherwise. That day, I heard my mother telling my father, the teachers are discriminating against our precious Jennifer. Days turned into years, and high school graduation day arrived. When my name was called as the valedictorian, my parents barely clapped. However, when Jennifer walked across the stage, they cheered as if she had won an Olympic gold medal. And then, the day everything changed arrived. The day after graduation, my mother announced at breakfast, barely able to keep still in her chair, I have some exciting news. We're going on a trip to Hawaii to celebrate your graduation. For a moment, my heart leaped, thinking that maybe, just maybe, this would be different. Look, my mother turned to me with a dismissive tone. We could only get 3 tickets. You understand, right? It's necessary for someone to stay behind to look after the house. She then tossed a thick envelope in front of me. Also, take a look at this. As I opened it, inside were numerous unpaid bills and detailed statements of debt. The total amount was staggering. Sort this out while we're gone, my father stated bluntly. You're smart, right? You should be able to handle it. Jennifer, stirring her orange juice, smirked smugly. Don't worry, Catherine. I'll send you lots of pictures from the beach. The next morning, I stood at the front door, watching them load their expensive suitcases into the taxi. Jennifer turned back with an exaggerated wave. I'll send you some lovely photos from Hawaii. They left me behind with a mountain of debt. As the taxi turned the corner and disappeared, I felt my body shake with anger and disappointment. At that moment, I remembered something, a shout from a phone call my mother had years ago. I don't want anything to do with it anymore. That cheap house and those tacky clothes, it's just embarrassing. I've moved up in social status. She had screamed, talking to her own parents. My grandparents, whom she referred to as low class, had been cut off completely, grandparents I had never met. I immediately sneaked into my mother's study and found her address book. At the very back, I found what seemed to be my grandparents' names alongside an address in an old town. That evening, I visited my grandparents' home, a modest house with a well-maintained garden. My heart pounded as I rang the doorbell. The door opened, and an elderly couple appeared. My grandmother had her gray hair neatly tied back, and my grandfather wore thin, framed glasses. "Who might you be?" They looked puzzled, but their expressions changed as I began to speak. "My name is Catherine Thompson. I believe you are my grandparents." My grandmother covered her mouth with her hand. "Oh, you are Dorothy's." Their warm gazes suddenly made me well up with tears. They invited me inside their home. I sat in their cozy living room, sipping the coffee they offered. They seemed unable to take their eyes off me. "You look just like your mother when she was young," my grandmother said softly, her tone imbued with nostalgia. For the first time, I experienced a sense of genuine recognition. I was recognized for who I was, not evaluated or compared. As I held back tears for years, they finally started to overflow. They left me behind. I began to sob as I told them about the years of differential treatment by my parents, the Hawaii trip, and the statement of debts. By the time I finished, my grandfather's expression had changed. Actually, he began in a firm yet gentle tone. "That house belongs to us. Your parents are merely tenants." He revealed that he had worked in real estate over 20 years ago, handling many prime properties as a senior executive. During prosperous times, he had the opportunity to buy that house, which was a liquidated property of the company, at a very low price. At that time, the neighborhood was underdeveloped, and the property values were minimal. My grandfather continued, "I saw the potential in real estate and invested almost all of our savings to buy it." "But my mother?" I asked, puzzled. "Dorothy said it was her house." My grandmother interjected, "After the company went bankrupt, we lived a modest life. It was really tough at times. Dorothy was ashamed of our life. When she was young, we were quite well off. She couldn't bear the downgraded lifestyle. She said she would succeed in business with Richard and not end up like me." My grandfather's voice was tinged with deep sadness. My grandmother explained that when my mother got married, my grandparents offered to provide a house for my parents with the agreement that they would pay rent. However, as my parents' business began to take off, my mother started telling people that they had bought the house themselves. "We turned a blind eye," my grandfather continued. "We knew Dorothy was embarrassed to admit receiving help from us, but it was understood that they would continue to make rent payments. However, rent payments began to fall behind about 5 years ago. The last call from Dorothy was 3 years ago." My grandmother's voice quivered slightly. She said, "We are managing the house for you. You should be grateful for that alone." And she claimed the property value had more than doubled. "We are managing it, so stop demanding rent like it's something prestigious." My grandfather continued with a bitter expression. After saying that, she hung up the phone and completely cut off contact with us. Since then, my father's real estate company had taken on significant debt from risky property investments and was suffering from serious business downturns. Behind their glamorous lifestyle, the debts were snowballing. Dorothy cut off ties with us and was ashamed to speak of us as poor parents. My grandmother's voice was filled with sorrow. But in reality, they were the ones who couldn't even pay the monthly rent. My eyes widened in shock. When Dorothy last called, we didn't sell the house because we thought maybe one day she would understand, my grandfather said with a stern expression. But we can't overlook this any longer. Meanwhile, my grandparents had been living modestly while investing in several companies, and those investments had paid off handsomely. Your mother left, saying we were too poor, my grandfather said, shaking his head. Ironically, we are now wealthier than ever. We just don't feel the need to show it off. Then my grandmother pulled out a bundle of aged documents. This is the deed to the house. We have kept all the records of unpaid rent. We have the right to dispose of the items in the house to pay off the debt. It's time to end your parents' lavish lifestyle. At that moment, my cell phone vibrated. It was a photo message from Jennifer posing on a Hawaiian beach with the caption, "Wish you were here, lol." I looked at the message, then at my grandparents' faces, and then at the stack of documents in front of me. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the lesser twin. Over the next 2 weeks, I slowly arranged for real estate agents and buyers. My parents' cherished luxury furniture, my mother's branded collections, my father's expensive car all were put up for sale. Each day, my phone vibrated with new notifications of Jennifer posing on different beaches, dining at upscale restaurants, and relaxing in infinity pools. Each picture was accompanied by increasingly arrogant captions. Living the best life. This is what success looks like. Winners spend their time in Hawaii, others only dream about it. As I continued with the task at hand, the house gradually emptied, feeling like the weight was being lifted from my heart. Then, the day they were due to return arrived. I pretended to read a book in the living room, peeking through the window. I watched as the taxi arrived and their reactions unfolded one by one. My mother was the first to enter the now bare house, stopping so abruptly that Jennifer, following close behind, bumped into her. My father, struggling with a set of expensive suitcases, nearly tripped over them. "What have you done?" my mother asked in a hollow voice, her hands trembling as she clutched her designer bag. "What did you do?" my father bellowed, his face red from the Hawaiian sun and shock. Jennifer burst out laughing, though her laugh was tinged with uncertainty. "You're joking, right? Everything's gone." "It's to pay off the debts," I replied calmly. "Oh, and take a look at this." I handed over the documents my grandparents had entrusted to me. "From Grandpa and Grandma. I heard they actually own this house, and they want you to leave." My mother's tan face went pale. "What?" "Yes, your parents, the two poor and embarrassing ones," I continued as I handed over the legal papers. "You have 30 days to vacate this house. Of course, I'm leaving too. I'm going to live with them." Jennifer started crying. "But what about my room, my clothes?" "Most of it's already sold to pay the debts." I smiled. The photos from Hawaii were nice, weren't they? My father turned to my mother. "Dorothy, call your parents right now," he commanded, using the same tone he used when ordering at a restaurant. My mother's hands trembled as she took out her cell phone, her French manicured nails sparkling in the sunlight. When my grandmother answered, my mother didn't even bother with a greeting but switched to speakerphone and shouted, "What is this about?" My grandmother's voice was calm and slightly amused. "Oh, it's been a while. Did you enjoy your fancy vacation? I saw the lovely pictures your daughter posted. The Royal Hawaiian Hotel is fabulous this time of year, isn't it?" "Don't change the subject. Why do we have to leave the house?" my mother demanded. "Well," my grandmother's voice was satisfied. "Your two poor and embarrassing parents are actually quite wealthy now." My mother's tone suddenly changed, becoming as sweet as honey. "Mom, I've been thinking. Let's put the past behind us and start over. Family is important, after all." "Indeed." My grandmother's voice was cold. My mother's eyes shifted toward Jennifer, who already seemed to be calculating something. "Did you forget Jennifer? Your other grandchild. If Jennifer loses the house and ends up homeless." My grandfather's laughter echoed over the phone. "Are you talking about the granddaughter you took to Hawaii, the one who left Catherine behind?" My mother's face turned red. "It's not like that. Look, grandparents should treat their grandchildren equally. They are the same age after all." "Equal?" My grandmother's voice sharpened. "I don't think you're one to talk. Shouldn't parents love their children equally?" But it seems that wasn't the case in your household. Before my mother could respond, the call ended. The weeks that followed were filled with turmoil. My parents tried desperately to reconcile with my grandparents, But it was too late. They were forced to move into a cheap apartment, and Jennifer struggled to accept that her luxurious lifestyle had crumbled instantly. Meanwhile, I started a new life at my grandparents' house. They fully supported my college education. Each morning, I woke up to the smell of my grandmother's warm coffee and chatted with my grandfather over the newspaper. I never knew such ordinary happiness could be so precious. As my new life at university began, I chose to study law. I wanted to specialize in family law in the future, protecting the rights of children who grow up in complex family environments. One evening, after returning from university, my grandmother told me, "Your parents came today." My heart skipped a beat. What did they say? Oh, the usual. My grandmother sighed. Your mother came with a fake smile, offered a hollow apology, tried to probe our financial situation, and hinted about Jennifer's upcoming birthday. Your father was looking around the house, probably trying to estimate our assets. How did you respond? My grandfather joined in. I told them that we've already decided on how our assets would be used. It's all going to you. I could imagine my mother's forced smile crumbling. What was their reaction? My grandmother laughed. Dorothy's smile definitely fell apart. I told them not to come back again. That night, I blocked my parents' and Jennifer's phone numbers, along with all their social media accounts. I knew messages of regret and offers to make amends would come, but I no longer needed such a family. I don't harbor any hatred toward them. Rather, I quietly accept that there comes a time when everyone must face the consequences of their choices. Living with my grandparents, I learned what unconditional love is. For the first time, I experienced the happiness of being recognized for who I am without comparison. Sometimes the most unexpected events can lead to the most beautiful outcomes. Now, as I take notes in my constitutional law class, I occasionally think about the little girl who once prayed for her parents' love. I want to tell her that something better is waiting. Not just love, but respect, support, and the freedom to be oneself. The love from my grandparents has given me the chance to turn a new page in my life. While my past with my parents came with pain, it has now strengthened me and become a part of who I am.